She was 8 houses from her front door. Not 8 blocks. Not 8 miles. 8 houses. 60 seconds of walking along a street she had crossed 100 times before. That 60-second stretch of pavement, between the bus stop on the corner and the yellow duplex at the end of Wright Avenue, was all that separated Angie Houseman from home, from her mother, from the rest of her life. She never made it. And the 30 years that followed that single Thursday afternoon in November of 1993 would become one of the most haunting, most heartbreaking cold cases in the history of Missouri. Welcome to Cold Case Vault. I'm glad you're here. But I have to warn you, this one is going to stay with you. If you're new here, Cold Case Vault exists so that the names no one talks about anymore never get forgotten. Subscribe right now, hit that bell, and drop a candle in the comments for Angie. Every single notification you turn on is another voice refusing to let this case go quiet. St. Anne, Missouri was the kind of place where parents did not worry. Not really. It sat tucked in the northwest corner of St. Louis County, just a few miles from the airport, a quiet, unremarkable suburb of modest houses, wide pavements, and the kind of neighborly ease that only exists in places where nothing bad has ever happened. Crime was low. Children rode their bicycles after school. Neighbors knew each other's names without needing to look at a mailbox. Parents sent their kids to the bus stop alone every morning and expected them back every afternoon, because that was just how things worked in St. Anne. That ordinary world was about to be destroyed forever. Angie Marie Houseman was 9 years old. She had blue eyes, brown hair, and a smile that people who knew her have never been able to fully describe without pausing. Her neighbors called her happy-go-lucky. Her teacher said she was popular. Her friends said she was the kind of kid who walked up to a complete stranger and made them feel like an old friend within 5 minutes. There was something about her, an openness, a warmth, that most people spend a lifetime trying to learn and never quite manage. She had big plans. Not the kind most 9-year-olds talk about. No dreams of being a pop star. No ambitions for professional sport. Angie Houseman wanted to be a nurse's aide. At 9 years old, she had already quietly decided that taking care of people was the entire point of her being here. That was not a phase. That was who she was. At home on Wright Avenue, she shared a duplex with her mother Diane, her stepfather Ron, and her 2-year-old half-brother Ronnie. The house was full of noise, the way houses are when a toddler lives in them, the particular, irreplaceable noise of an ordinary family on an ordinary street. Outside the front of the house grew a rose bush. Angie and Diane had planted it together 2 years earlier, pressing roots into cold Missouri soil in memory of an uncle who had passed away. A small, quiet thing. A girl and her mother side by side in the dirt with no idea that one day that rose bush would outlive Angie. That eventually it would outlive Diane, too. A year before she disappeared, Angie had won a $500 shopping spree at a local toy store. She chose one thing for herself, a pink bicycle with a radio built into the handlebars. Then she told the people running the contest to give the rest of the money to children who needed it more. She was 8 years old when she did that. That was Angie. On the 18th of November, 1993, a Thursday, Angie stepped off the school bus at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The stop was at the corner of Wright Avenue and St. Gregory Lane, half a block from her front door. She was wearing a light pink coat. A blue and white book bag hung from her shoulders. One specific item she had on that day, a piece of pink children's clothing with a distinct dark band running across it, looked completely unremarkable at the time. It would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. She had walked this route every school day. She knew every crack in that pavement. There was a woman on Wright Avenue who had a quiet, informal habit, watching the neighborhood children walk home from the bus. Not official. Not organized. Just a neighbor keeping an eye out the way good people in quiet streets tend to do without making a fuss about it. But on the 18th of November, she wasn't there. She was looking after a sick relative. Another neighbor who sometimes watched from her porch was also unavailable that day. 2 small absences. 2 unremarkable gaps in a safety net that had been woven without anyone ever sitting down to design it. And on that particular afternoon, those 2 gaps lined up perfectly, leaving one 60-second window of silence on Wright Avenue at the exact moment Angie was walking through it. Did someone know the neighbors would be away? Or were they simply patient? Watching the street, day after day, waiting for the one afternoon when nobody was looking? Angie's classmates walked with her for part of the route. They watched her pass the 4th house. After that, she was on her own. After that, nobody saw a single thing. No scream. No struggle. No sound at all. She was there, and then she wasn't. Inside the duplex, Diane was napping with 2-year-old Ronnie, waiting for the sound she heard every afternoon without fail. The front door. The footsteps. The heavy thud of a book bag dropped onto the floor. That sound never came. When Ron's truck pulled into the driveway at 5 o'clock, the silence in the house told him everything before he even stepped inside. No Angie. No bag. No sign that she had ever come through the door. At first, they did what most parents do when the world hasn't yet turned terrible. They told themselves there was an explanation. Maybe she stopped at a friend's house. Maybe she lost track of time. But as the minutes stretched past 30, then 45, the quality of the air inside the duplex changed in a way that no parent should ever have to feel. Ron and Diane went outside. They walked the route. They called her name. Neighbors poured out of their houses and joined them. They knocked on every door on the block. They checked every yard. Nothing. At 10 minutes past 7 that evening, they called the police. Officers arrived and understood immediately. This was not a child who had wandered off. It was cold. It was getting dark. K9 units were called in that same night. The dogs picked up Angie's scent at the bus stop and followed it down Wright Avenue, pulling hard, nose to the ground, the trail clear and strong. For a brief, terrible moment it seemed like it might end quickly. Then, roughly halfway between the bus stop and her house, the dogs stopped. Not slowed. Not confused. Stopped. They didn't circle. They didn't cast for a new direction. They sat down, right there on the pavement between 2 yellow porch lights, and the trail simply ended. Not faded. Not scattered. Cut off clean. Like a cliff in the middle of an ordinary residential street. Sergeant Jim Mantle told a reporter the following day, she couldn't just vanish. We don't know what happened. But the dogs knew something. The scent had not drifted. It had been severed. The most likely explanation was the one nobody had yet said out loud, that somewhere on that stretch of Wright Avenue, a vehicle had been waiting. That Angie had been inside it before the neighborhood even realized she was missing. That whoever had taken her had planned this. That they had chosen their spot, timed their moment, and been ready. Helicopters swept low over nearby parks and creek banks with infrared sensors through the night. They found nothing. The parks were empty. The creek banks were quiet. Angie Houseman had been missing for fewer than 3 hours, and the trail was already gone. The scent stopped like she had been lifted off the ground and carried away. Because she had. By the following morning, Angie Houseman's face was everywhere, on every television screen, on telephone poles, on the front page of every newspaper in St. Louis. In fewer than 12 hours, a missing 9-year-old from a quiet suburb had become the only story anyone in the city was talking about. And the police were already frightened. The St. and police department did not handle this alone. Within the first day, they called in the major case squad of Greater St. Louis, a specialized unit assembled from officers across multiple departments, purpose-built for exactly this kind of investigation. The FBI joined shortly after. More than 20 additional officers were assigned. Every ditch, every abandoned structure, every inch of Missouri brush was turned over. In the first 24 hours alone, the tip line received over 300 calls. 300 people who believed they had seen something, heard something, or knew something. Detectives worked through every single one. Every single one went nowhere. Robert Lowry Jr., who commanded the major case squad, later told reporters, "A little girl gets off the school bus and she's 100 feet from her house, and she disappears into the silence of a Thursday afternoon. I don't understand it." Neither did anyone else. But there was something that made this case even more urgent, something that had happened just 10 days before Angie vanished, and something the police had not forgotten. On the 8th of November, in nearby Maryland Heights, an 11-year-old girl had stepped off her school bus and started walking home. A man approached her. He grabbed her and tried to drag her into the bushes. She fought back. She broke free. She ran. She survived, and she gave police a description. Similar age to Angie. Same method, school bus, same time of day, same type of quiet residential street. A composite sketch was drawn up and distributed across the region. But what made investigators uneasy was not the sketch itself. It was what the Maryland Heights attack revealed about the attacker's thinking. He had not acted on impulse. He had positioned himself near a school bus stop at the precise moment children would be walking home alone. He had chosen his location. He had chosen his timing. He had chosen his target. In 1993, justice relied on the blurred memory of an 11-year-old and a charcoal pencil. No cameras. No footage. No digital trail. And that man, the one from the sketch, was still somewhere out there, watching the same news bulletins as everyone else. Was Angie's disappearance his second attempt? Detectives could not confirm it. But they could not dismiss it either. Meanwhile, the family was fracturing in the way that families do, quietly, behind closed doors, where no cameras ever reach. Ron went back to work, because he did not know what else to do with his hands. But a spanner feels different in your grip when you are wondering whether those same hands should have been holding your daughters at 4 o'clock. His co-workers later said he would stop mid-job and hit the wall, not out of rage at any one person, but because standing still meant feeling everything at once. Diane was worse. She could not look out the window. That ordinary street, the same street Angie had crossed 100 times, had become something unbearable. She kept the curtains closed. Every time she caught a glimpse of the bus stop, she broke down completely. The house that had always been loud with the sounds of children and cooking and ordinary life was now quiet in a way that felt like an open wound that would not close. Investigators looked at Ron early on, the way they always look at the people closest to a missing child. He agreed to a polygraph without hesitation. He passed. He told detectives, "Stop wasting time on me and go find her." They also tracked down Angie's biological father, Angelo DeAndrea, a man who had never been part of Angie's life, yet apparently could not stay away from the edges of it. According to Diane, he had driven past the house on Wright Avenue multiple times over the years, watching Angie play in the front yard from the safety of his car window. He never introduced himself. Never spoke to her. A child he observed like a film from his driver's seat, present enough to witness, distant enough to deny. It was unsettling. But his alibi was solid. He had not been anywhere near St. and on the 18th of November. Another door that swung open onto nothing. Then, a few days into the investigation, a detail surfaced that changed the entire shape of the case. One of Angie's teachers came forward. In the days before she disappeared, Angie had mentioned something at school, casually, the way children mention things that seem completely ordinary to them. She had told her teacher she was going on a nature trip soon. With her uncle. Detectives went straight back to the family. They asked about the uncle. There was no uncle. Angie did not have an uncle who took her on nature trips. Ron and Diane had no idea what she was talking about. No family member, no family friend, nobody in Angie's life matched that description. So who had she been talking about? In the world of a 9-year-old, the word uncle is not just a title. It is a shield. It is a word a child uses for a man who has earned their trust, someone familiar, someone safe, someone whose company feels normal and good. This was not a stranger who had grabbed her on a street corner. This was someone who had spent time with her. Someone who had learned how she thought. Someone who had given himself a warm, familiar name and made her believe that a trip into the woods was something exciting to look forward to. That takes weeks. Possibly longer. It does not happen in a single afternoon. This was not random. Someone had watched Angie's routine. Learned her schedule. Chosen her. And the most devastating part of all was this: she had never felt afraid. She had gone to school and mentioned the trip to her teacher the way you mention something you're looking forward to. She trusted him completely. But no name came with the word uncle. No face. No one in Angie's world could point to a man she had been spending extra time with. The nature trip existed in one sentence spoken to a teacher and nowhere else. A clue with no edges and no way to hold on to it. Days continued to pass. The tip line kept ringing. Every lead collapsed the moment detectives touched it. The composite sketch was broadcast across the region. A man in a blue sedan had been spotted driving slowly through the neighborhood, his description matching the sketch. Thousands of flyers went out across St. Louis. His identity never surfaced. 1 week passed. Right now, somewhere out there, there are more cases like Angie's, families still waiting, evidence still sitting in boxes, names still being forgotten. Cold Case Vault covers every one we can find. If this story matters to you, like this video and share it with one person. That one share might reach someone who remembers something. It has happened before. 9 days after Angie Houseman stepped off that school bus, on a cold gray morning, 2 deer hunters walked into the Bush Wildlife Conservation Area in St. Charles County. Dry leaves crunched under their boots. The Missouri sky sat low and heavy. They were looking for game. They were not looking for a little girl. But they found one. She was within earshot of passing cars, just 50 feet from the road, in a patch of woods that hundreds of people drove past every single day without a second glance. The trees all looked the same in the gray morning light of the 27th of November. The brush was thick. The ground was frozen. They were scanning the branches for movement when one of them looked down. Lieutenant Ed Copeland was among the first officers on the scene. He said later, "It was cold, cloudy, just a dreary day. I saw a young child's body in the woods. It was very shocking. I pretty much knew who it was. Everyone knew who it was." Near her body, investigators found plastic bags. Inside them, a light pink coat. Tennis shoes. Red socks. A t-shirt. And school books, their pages still intact, with a name written carefully on the covers in the handwriting of a 9-year-old on the first day of school. Angie Houseman. She had carried those books on her back on the afternoon of the 18th of November. Now they were sitting in the frozen dirt of a wildlife conservation area 20 miles from her home. That careful, childlike handwriting on the cover of a school book, the kind of thing a 9-year-old does with a new felt-tip pen, pressing down a little too hard, was now evidence in a murder investigation. What the scene told investigators, piece by piece, was far worse than a child who had simply been left in the woods. She had been brought here fewer than 24 hours before she was found. Which meant that for more than 200 hours before this moment, more than 8 full days, she had been somewhere else. Alive. And whoever had taken her had made a final, deliberate choice to bring her to these particular woods only at the very end. She had been restrained. Secured to a tree with metal hardware. Covered in adhesive tape in a deliberate act to ensure her silence and eliminate every chance of escape. The frozen dirt at the base of that tree held the only record of her final hours, marks in the soil, back and forth, uneven and desperate. Mud caked onto the bottoms of her bare feet. She had been walked into those woods without her shoes. And those marks were not just the signs of a struggle. They were the footprints of a 9-year-old girl who refused to stop fighting until she had absolutely nothing left. She did not get free. The autopsy confirmed what the scene had already begun to tell. Over more than a week in captivity, Angie had been given almost no food and almost no water. Her body, by the time the hunters found her, bore the full weight of what had been done to her across those 9 days. Signs of physical trauma had been covered with tape, an indication that her captor intended to prolong what he was doing, not end it. Her hair had been cut short. Its color had been changed. These were not accidents. They were decisions, made calmly, across multiple days, by someone who was thinking clearly the entire time. And then, at the end, that same person had walked her barefoot into freezing Missouri woods in late November, secured her to a tree, and left. Walked back to their car. Drove away. While she was still breathing. The official cause of death was hypothermia. Ice chips had gathered on her shoulders and in her hair by the time the hunters found her. He had not ended it. He had simply walked away into the dark and let the cold finish what he had begun. Attorney Tim Lamar, who would later prosecute this case, said she had struggled extensively to free herself before she ultimately perished. 9 years old. She fought until she had nothing left. Forensic teams processed every inch of that scene. Over 150 pieces of evidence were collected. Among everything gathered, 2 things stood apart from everything else. The first was a DNA sample, biological material that could one day identify whoever had done this. In 1993, the technology to fully analyze it in a way that would hold up in court did not yet exist. The second was a fingerprint, lifted from the adhesive side of the duct tape. The side that had been pressed against her face. It was partial. Not enough to run through a national database. But enough to compare against a suspect, if the right person was ever found. A killer's identity was sitting in a cardboard evidence box on a shelf. Trapped in a partial smudge of oil and skin and whatever quiet terror had lived in those final moments on that frozen ground. It was right there. But the world was not yet ready to read it. That fingerprint would wait for 25 years. For days after Angie's body was found, St. Louis was struck again. On the 1st of December, 10-year-old Cassidy Center disappeared in Bridgeton, 10 miles from St. Anne. She had been walking to a friend's house to put up Christmas decorations. She had a personal protection alarm clipped to her coat. A neighbor heard it sound and rushed outside. The device was lying on the ground by the road. Cassidy was gone. Parents across St. Louis stopped letting their children outside. Schools held emergency meetings. The city settled into the kind of fear that does not announce itself loudly, the kind that just lives, quietly, behind every closed curtain and every porch light left burning all through the night. When Cassidy's body was found 8 days later, and when detectives closed in on her killer, a man named Thomas Brooks, who had taken her into the basement of a house near her friend's home, something became clear in a way that made everything harder, not easier. Thomas Brooks had nothing to do with Angie Houseman. The crimes looked identical from the outside. Same city. Same month. Same age range. But the evidence pulled in entirely different directions. There was not one predator haunting the suburbs of St. Louis that winter. There were 2. In the same month. In the same city. And the one who had taken Angie was still completely invisible. A killer's fingerprint sat in a cardboard box in an evidence room. A DNA sample sat alongside it. And somewhere out there, a man was going about his life as though nothing had happened. Driving to work. Eating dinner. Sleeping. Watching the same news broadcasts that carried Angie's photograph. Living in the world that Angie no longer lived in. That box would stay closed for a very long time. The weeks after Angie's funeral turned into months. The months turned into years. The case that had gripped an entire city began, slowly and quietly, to go cold. Not because the police stopped caring. Not because the family stopped hurting. But because every road led to the same place, a brick wall with no door and no way through. The first real suspect had come from the composite sketch, shortly after Angie disappeared. Someone who had seen the drawing recognized it. His name was Gary Stufflebean, 37 years old, from Houston, Texas, and he had been in the St. Louis area in early November. Detectives investigated him intensely. But the evidence could not place him at the scene on the 18th. That door closed. Other names came and went. Other tip calls, other sketches, other knock-on-the-door conversations in the middle of the afternoon that led nowhere. The major case squad eventually scaled back. The FBI's active involvement diminished. The tip line grew quieter. St. and moved on, not because it wanted to, but because small suburban streets have no choice but to keep going, and children still needed to go to school, and buses still pulled up to the corner of Wright Avenue and St. Gregory Lane every single afternoon at 4 o'clock. Diane kept the curtains closed for years. She could not walk past the bus stop. There are things that happen to parents who lose children in the way that Angie was lost that simply cannot be described from the outside, a particular kind of grief that has no bottom, that does not follow the stages, that lives in the ordinary moments, in the sound of a school bus at 4 o'clock, in the sight of a rose bush in spring, in the feel of a book bag. Ron carried it differently. Quietly. The way men of that generation were raised to carry things, inward, without ceremony, with their hands always busy doing something because the alternative was unthinkable. Ronnie grew up knowing his sister only from photographs and from the way his parents went quiet at certain times of the year. And outside the house on Wright Avenue, the rose bush kept blooming. Every spring, without being asked. The way it always had. The fingerprint waited on its shelf. Years of advances in forensic science moved forward, case by case, crime by crime, database by database. DNA technology evolved. Familial DNA searching became possible, the ability to look not just for an exact match in a national database, but for a close relative of a match, and work backwards. By the middle of the 2010s, genealogical DNA databases maintained by Ancestry and family history websites held the genetic profiles of tens of millions of ordinary people who had simply wanted to know where their grandparents came from. Investigators in cold cases across America began to realize what those databases represented. Not just family trees. Maps. Maps that could, under the right circumstances, lead back to a killer. In 2019, investigators in the Angie Houseman case submitted the biological material collected from that frozen conservation area in 1993 for advanced DNA analysis. The technology that had not existed when Angie was found now existed in a way that could be applied to evidence 26 years old. The profile they built was compared against genealogical databases. It pointed to a family. And from that family, investigators worked forward, building a tree, narrowing the branches, eliminating relatives one by one until one name remained. David Sinopoli. He was in his 50s. He had lived in the St. Louis area at the time of the crime. He was known to the system, not a ghost, not a drifter, but a man with a name and an address and a life that had continued uninterrupted for more than a quarter of a century. Investigators obtained a DNA sample from Sinopoli covertly. It matched the evidence from the conservation area. They then retrieved the partial fingerprint, the one lifted from the adhesive side of the duct tape, the side that had been pressed against Angie's face, the one that had waited on its shelf since November of 1993. They compared it to Sinopoli's prints. It matched. David Sinopoli was arrested in 2019 and charged with the first-degree murder of Angie Marie Houseman. He was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing, Tim Lamar, the attorney who had spent years refusing to let this case go, spoke about what Angie had endured in those final hours in the woods. He said she had struggled extensively to free herself before she ultimately perished. He said it not to horrify, but to testify. To make sure that everyone in that courtroom understood what she had done. What she had refused to stop doing, even then. 9 years old. Against a tree in the frozen dark. And she fought. Outside the house on Wright Avenue, the rose bush Angie and her mother planted together in memory of a lost uncle still grows. Diane passed away before justice came. She never saw the arrest. She never sat in that courtroom. She never heard the verdict. She carried this for the rest of her life and died still carrying it, still keeping her curtains closed against a street she could never entirely forgive. But the case was solved. The name was found. The fingerprint that waited 25 years on a shelf in an evidence room finally said what it had always known. Angie Houseman wanted to be a nurse's aide. She wanted to take care of people. At 9 years old, she had already decided that helping others was what her life was going to be about. She planted a rose bush with her mother. She gave away a shopping spree. She went to school and told her teacher about a nature trip because she trusted people, because that was the kind of person she was, and because nothing in her 9 years of living had given her any reason not to. She was 8 houses from her front door. She never got there. But she is not forgotten. Angie fought to the very last moment. The least we can do is remember her name. If this case moved you, and I think it did, subscribe to Cold Case Vault so you never miss a story like this one. Leave a comment below telling us what part of Angie's story stayed with you. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it. More cases are waiting in the description below. We are not done yet.